I went to my granddaughter's wedding at the Ritz-Carlton in Boston carrying a vintage pearl necklace that belonged to my late wife. But at the grand ballroom doors, my own son blocked my path. He looked me dead in the eye and whispered, "Dad, you are not on the list. There was a mistake. Go home." 200 of the city's elite guests stared at me. I did not yell. I did not beg. I just said, "It is fine, son." I walked out into the freezing night, got into my car, and called my attorney. The next morning, my son received a letter that completely destroyed his life. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to family who underestimated your worth. I am Richard, 70 years old, and somehow still healing from wounds my family inflicted. As a successful corporate founder, I thought I had given them everything, but I only fed their greed. Let me tell you exactly how it happened. The winter wind cutting across Boston Common was brutal that evening, but I barely felt it. I was 70 years old, wearing a custom Tom Ford tuxedo that my late wife Sarah had always loved. In my right pocket, resting against my chest, was a worn velvet box. Inside it lay Sarah's vintage pearl necklace, the exact one she wore on our wedding day 45 years ago. I had been saving it for this very night to clasp it around the neck of my granddaughter Harper before she walked down the aisle. I stepped out of my Lincoln town car and handed the keys to the valet, taking a deep breath of the crisp December air. The Ritz-Carlton lobby was a symphony of warmth and elegance. Soft piano music drifted through the air, mingling with the low hum of wealthy conversations and the clinking of crystal glasses. I walked toward the grand ballroom, feeling a profound sense of pride. I had spent 40 years building Mitchell Global Supply from a single rusted delivery truck into a global logistics empire. I sacrificed my youth, my sleep, and countless weekends just to ensure that my family would never know the sting of poverty. Tonight was supposed to be the culmination of all that hard work. I was going to watch my beautiful granddaughter marry the man she loved at an event that I had entirely funded. As I approached the carved mahogany doors of the ballroom, the heavy scent of imported white orchids filled the corridor. I smiled, recognizing the flowers. Then I saw him. My son Bradley stood right at the entrance, looking sharp in a tailored tailcoat. For a fleeting second, my heart swelled. I thought he was waiting there to greet me, to walk me inside and seat me at the family table. I raised my hand to wave, but as I got closer, the smile on my face slowly died. Bradley's posture was rigid. His jaw was clenched, and his eyes, darting nervously toward the crowd inside, held absolutely no warmth. He stepped directly into my path, physically blocking the double doors with his broad shoulders. "Dad," he whispered, his voice low and tight. "What are you doing here?" The question threw me off balance. "What do you mean?" "What am I doing here, Bradley?" "I am here for Harper's wedding." I tapped my pocket. "I brought your mother's pearls for her." Bradley swallowed hard, glancing over his shoulder before turning back to me. His expression hardened into a mask of cold indifference. "Dad, you are not on the list." I stared at him, trying to process the words. I thought it was a joke, a poor attempt at wedding day humor. "Not on the list." "Bradley, I am the grandfather of the bride." "There was a mistake with the seating chart," he said without breaking eye contact. "The venue is at strict capacity. The fire marshal is very particular about these things. There is literally no chair for you in there. Go home, Dad. Go home before you cause a scene and ruin Harper's night." My blood ran cold. The sheer absurdity of his words hung in the air like a physical blow. A mistake. Strict capacity. 6 months ago, Bradley had come to my house begging for financial help. He told me Harper needed capital for her new startup and a budget for the wedding. Without a second thought, I had my bank wire $1.2 million directly into his personal account. I funded every single aspect of this lavish affair. The champagne flowing inside the imported orchids, filling the halls, the jazz band playing in the background, I paid for all of it. And now the man who took my money was standing in the doorway, telling me there was no chair for me. Before I could formulate a response, a figure stepped out from the shadows of the ballroom entrance. It was my daughter-in-law, Monica. She was draped in a designer silk gown, holding a glass of champagne. She slipped her arm through Bradley's and looked at me with an expression of pure, unadulterated disgust. It was the kind of look you give a beggar who has wandered too close to your table at a fine dining restaurant. Richard, what part of go home do you not understand? She sneered, her voice dripping with venom. This is an exclusive event. We cannot have you wandering around confusing the guests. We have important people here tonight. I looked past her shoulder into the brightly lit ballroom. The doors were open wide enough for me to see the crowd. These were not just friends of the bride and groom. I recognized faces. I saw venture capitalists I used to negotiate with. I saw shipping magnates and former partners from Mitchell Global Supply. These were my peers, my colleagues, the elite circle of the Boston business world. And they were watching me. I could see them whispering to each other, covering their mouths with their hands, pointing subtly at the 70-year-old founder of the company, being turned away at the door like a common wedding crasher. The humiliation burned my cheeks, but it was quickly swallowed by a glacial clarity. Monica leaned in closer, her heavy perfume turning my stomach. Security is standing right over there, Richard. If you do not turn around and walk out those doors right now, I will have them escort you off the premises. Do not test me. Any other father might have screamed. Any other man might have demanded to see his granddaughter, or caused a massive scene to expose them in front of the 200 guests. But I did not survive 40 years in the corporate shark tank by throwing tantrums. I knew that screaming would only validate whatever lies they had already told the crowd about me. I looked at Monica taking in the diamonds hanging from her ears, diamonds bought with my money. Then I looked at Bradley, the son I had carried on my shoulders, the boy I had given everything to. He refused to meet my gaze, looking down at the polished marble floor instead. "It is fine, son," I said, my voice dangerously calm and steady. "I understand completely. Do not worry about me." I did not wait for his response. I turned my back on them and walked away. The heavy mahogany doors shut behind me, sealing the warmth and the music inside, but I did not look back. I walked through the lobby, my footsteps echoing against the stone floor. The valet looked surprised to see me return so quickly, but he hurried to retrieve my car. When I stepped out into the freezing Boston night, the cold air hit my face like a splash of ice water, bringing me fully back to my senses. I slid into the quiet leather interior of my Lincoln Town Car. The silence of the cabin was deafening. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the velvet box, running my thumb over the worn fabric. They did not just reject me, they erased me. The pieces of the puzzle suddenly began clicking together in my mind. The lack of phone calls, the vague excuses, the sudden demand for cash 6 months ago. This was not a seating chart mistake. This was a calculated execution. I pulled out my cell phone. The clock on the dashboard read 7:30 p.m. I dialed the private number of Jonathan Pierce, my lead corporate attorney. He answered on the second ring. "Richard," he said, sounding surprised. "Should you not be giving a toast at the Ritz right now?" "Jonathan," I said, my voice void of any emotion. "Bradley just locked me out of the wedding." A heavy pause fell over the line. The seasoned lawyer knew exactly what that meant. "What do you need me to do, Richard?" "Trigger the winter protocol," I commanded, staring out the tinted window at the glowing facade of the hotel. "Freeze everything. The trust, the accounts, the corporate access. I want every single dollar tied to that boy locked down by sunrise." "It is done, Richard," Jonathan replied, a dangerous edge entering his tone. "But you need to see the bank logs first thing tomorrow. They did not just spend the wedding money. They have been digging into the corporate vault." I ended the call and leaned my head back against the leather seat. They thought they had won. They thought they had humiliated a helpless old man. But tomorrow morning, my son and his greedy wife were going to learn a very painful lesson. You do not lock the wolf out of the house when the wolf is the one who built it. I settled into the deep leather seat of my Lincoln town car. The heavy door closed with a solid thud, blocking out the biting Boston wind and the faint strains of jazz music spilling from the Ritz-Carlton lobby. Inside the cabin it was completely silent, save for the low hum of the engine. My driver Martin glanced at me through the rearview mirror. His eyes carried a quiet concern. He had been driving me for over 15 years, and he knew the schedule perfectly well. He knew I was supposed to be walking Harper down the aisle right at this very moment. "Are you all right, Mr. Mitchell?" Martin asked, his voice gentle and respectful. I did not answer immediately. I took the velvet box containing Sarah's vintage pearl necklace out of my pocket and placed it carefully on the leather seat next to me. The pearls felt incredibly heavy now, as if they absorbed all the weight of the evening. I smoothed the lapels of my tuxedo and let out a long, measured breath. I was not angry. I was not devastated. A strange, absolute calm had settled over my mind like a fresh layer of frost. "I am perfectly fine, Martin," I said, keeping my voice entirely steady. "Drive me to Beacon Hill. Take the long way through the city." "Right away, sir," he replied, shifting the car into gear and pulling smoothly away from the curb. I watched the glowing facade of the hotel shrink in the side mirror. My son and my daughter-in-law were inside that golden box, drinking expensive champagne bought with my money, entertaining the elite circles of the city while tossing me into the cold. It was a flawless execution of disrespect. But it was not an emotional outburst. It was a calculated test. As the car glided through the illuminated streets of downtown Boston, I stared at the towering glass skyscrapers that defined the financial district. I had spent 40 years of my life conquering this city. Building Mitchell Global Supply from a single rusting delivery truck into a multi-million-dollar international logistics empire was not a matter of luck. It took 4 decades of ruthless negotiations, sleepless nights, and a relentless drive to succeed. I sacrificed my own youth so that my family would never have to experience the suffocating grip of poverty that I grew up with. I remembered the early days when Sarah and I lived in a cramped one-bedroom apartment. I remembered working consecutive night shifts, loading pallets with my own bleeding hands, while Bradley slept safely in his crib. I paid for his elite private schools, his Ivy League education, his sports cars, and his luxury vacations. I gave him a life completely insulated from hardship. I built a fortress of wealth around him, hoping it would make him a strong, secure man. Instead, it made him incredibly weak and dangerously greedy. Looking out at the harbor lights reflecting on the dark water, I realized the bitter truth. The incident at the ballroom doors was not a sudden misunderstanding about a seating chart or a strict fire marshal capacity limit. Monica's sneering face and Bradley's refusal to meet my eyes told a much deeper story. They were probing the perimeter. They were testing the fences to see if the old man was finally too weak, too tired, or too senile to fight back. They thought my grief over losing Sarah had softened my spine. They assumed I would just go home, cry quietly into my whiskey, and accept my forced retirement from the family hierarchy. They calculated that I would avoid a public scandal at all costs. They were right about the scandal. I despise public theatrics, but they were fundamentally wrong about my willingness to surrender. You do not survive 40 years in the global shipping industry by turning the other cheek when someone tries to cut your throat. I reached into my breast pocket and pulled out my cell phone. I did not shed a single tear. There was no room for sorrow when survival was on the line. I scrolled to the private number of Jonathan Pierce. Jonathan was not just a corporate attorney. He was a legal predator, a man who navigated the treacherous waters of corporate law with the precision of a surgeon and the ruthlessness of a mercenary. He had been my closest advisor for 2 decades. The phone rang exactly twice before he answered. Richard Jonathan said, his deep voice carrying a note of genuine surprise. "I was expecting to hear from you tomorrow. Should you not be giving the patriarch's speech at the reception right now?" I kept my eyes fixed on the passing streetlights. Jonathan. Bradley locked me out of the wedding. He stopped me at the doors and told me I was not on the list. The silence on the other end of the line was absolute. Jonathan knew the exact power dynamics of my family. He knew the massive financial contributions I had recently made to support Bradley's lifestyle and Harper's supposed business ventures. He understood immediately that this was an act of war. I see Jonathan finally said, his tone shifting from casual conversation to cold professional focus. "What are your instructions, Richard?" "Trigger the winter protocol," I commanded. "Freeze everything." The winter protocol was a contingency plan we had drafted years ago during a particularly vicious, hostile takeover attempt by a rival firm. It was designed to sever all financial arteries immediately. Executing it meant freezing every trust account, every shared corporate credit line, and every piece of collateral tied to the Mitchell estate. It meant shutting off the lifeblood of Bradley's luxurious existence in a matter of seconds. "I want the trust frozen." I continued, my voice echoing softly in the quiet car. "I want the shared company cards deactivated. I want the escrow account, where I deposited the $1.2 million, placed under an immediate administrative lock. If he tries to buy a pack of gum tomorrow morning, I want his card declined. He wants me out of his life. He can start by paying for his own." I could hear the rapid clicking of a keyboard on Jonathan's end of the line. Even on a Saturday night, he was sitting in his home office, ready to mobilize our defense. "Consider it done, Richard," Jonathan said. "I am submitting the electronic freeze requests to the primary financial institutions right now. The blackout will be fully effective before midnight. I will draft the notices," Jonathan assured me. But he did not hang up. I heard him take a slow, heavy breath. "Richard," he said, his voice dropping an octave, "while I have the banking portal open, I am looking at the transaction logs for the primary corporate holding accounts. It is done, Richard. The protocol is active. But you need to come to my office tomorrow morning. You must see these bank logs with your own eyes. They did not just spend the wedding money, Richard. They have actually been digging deep into the main corporate vault now. We have to act right now before the sunrise." I ended the call with Jonathan and instructed Martin to pull up to my Beacon Hill residence. The wrought iron gates swung open silently, welcoming me into a home that suddenly felt too large and too empty. I stepped out of the car, thanked Martin for his loyalty, and walked through the heavy oak front doors. The house was completely dark, save for the ambient moonlight filtering through the tall windows. I did not bother turning on the main lights. I walked straight down the hallway and entered my home office. The rich scent of aged leather and mahogany usually brought me comfort, but tonight it offered no solace. I began to pace the length of the Persian rug, the rhythmic sound of my footsteps echoing against the walls lined with decades of corporate awards and framed newspaper clippings. My mind was racing, trying to untangle the web of deception that had just ensnared me. How did a man who spent 40 years anticipating the treacherous maneuvers of global competitors miss a betrayal taking root inside his own family? The answer was painful but simple. I had taken off my armor around my own blood. I allowed myself to be a father instead of a chief executive officer. It started exactly 6 months ago, right here in this very room. The memory played in my mind with agonizing clarity. I was sitting at my desk reviewing quarterly projections when the doors flew open. Bradley stormed in, his face flushed, and his tie loosened, a perfect portrait of a man on the edge of a total breakdown. He collapsed into the chair across from me, breathing heavily, and dropped a thick stack of manila folders onto my desk. He told me that he had received an advanced warning from a contact at the Internal Revenue Service. According to Bradley, the agency was launching a brutal, comprehensive audit on our family trust. He spun a terrifying narrative claiming they were targeting my personal retirement funds and threatening to freeze the entire estate while the investigation dragged on for years. He said the scrutiny was triggered by an aggressive new tax regulation and that our traditional corporate shields were temporarily vulnerable. He looked me in the eyes, his hands actually shaking, and delivered his plausible lie. "Dad, They are targeting your retirement funds, he had pleaded, his voice cracking with manufactured desperation. We need to sign a temporary power of attorney right now. We have to move $1.2 million into a secure escrow account under my name. It is the only way to protect your liquid assets and secure her entire future until the audit ends. Looking back now, the corporate titan inside me should have seen the glaring holes in his story. I should have called my own accountants. I should have demanded to see the official federal notices. I should have summoned Jonathan Pierce immediately. But Bradley did not come to the founder of Mitchell Global Supply. He came to his father. He came to a man who was still drowning in the quiet, lingering grief of losing his wife. Sarah had always been the emotional anchor of our family, the one who held us together. Without her, I was desperate to keep the remaining pieces of our family intact. When a son comes to you, terrified, pleading for help to save her very future, the ruthless businessman steps aside and the protective father takes the wheel. I signed the documents because my fundamental instinct was to shield my boy from a crisis. I wanted to absorb his panic. I wanted to fix the problem just as I had fixed every other problem in his life since he was a child. I believed I was placing a protective wall around our family wealth, unaware that I was actually handing him the keys to the vault. I authorized the transfer of $1.2 million, believing it was going to a safe harbor. I stopped pacing. The heavy silence of the office snapped me back to the present moment. The chill of the Boston night seemed to seep through the window panes, creeping into my bones. Bradley had used my protective instinct as a weapon against me. He had weaponized my love for Harper and my grief for Sarah to orchestrate a massive financial extraction. But the game was not over. If Jonathan was right about the bank logs, the rabbit hole was much deeper than a stolen wedding fund. I walked around the massive desk and sat in my high-backed leather chair. I woke up my laptop. The screen cast a harsh blue glow across the darkened room. I logged into my encrypted personal server, navigating through layers of security protocols to access my digital archives. I needed to see the document that had started this entire nightmare. I needed to scrutinize the temporary power of attorney that I had signed 6 months ago. My fingers moved rapidly across the keyboard, opening the scanned file. The document appeared on the screen, bearing my bold signature at the bottom of the final page. I zoomed in on the fine print, my eyes scanning the legal jargon with the cold precision of a predator hunting for a blood trail. Bradley had rushed me through the signing process, pointing only to the signature lines, claiming time was of the essence. Now isolated in the silence of my office, I read every single word. I scrolled down to the notary acknowledgement section. My eyes locked onto the circular stamp pressed into the bottom corner. A chilling realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. The notary seal on the document was not from Pearson and Associates, the prestigious corporate law firm that had handled the Mitchell family affairs for nearly 3 decades. The name on the seal belonged to an entity called Apex Fiduciary Solutions. It was a generic name, the kind of name designed to sound legitimate, while revealing absolutely nothing. I opened a new browser tab and ran a quick search on the registry of corporate entities. My suspicion was confirmed in seconds. Apex Fiduciary Solutions was not a law firm. It was not a registered financial institution. It was a shell company incorporated in Delaware just 3 days before Bradley had stormed into my office with his fabricated audit story. He had not just panicked and made a mistake. He had premeditated the entire extraction. He had set up a dummy corporation, manufactured a fake federal crisis, and brought in a fraudulent notary to legitimize the theft of my assets. He had been planning to drain me dry long before he ever stood at the doors of the Ritz-Carlton. Every single detail of his panic had been carefully rehearsed to bypass my natural corporate defenses. He played me for a fool, banking on my paternal love to blind me to his immense betrayal. But as I sat staring at the glowing screen, the sorrow completely evaporated. It was instantly replaced by a cold, calculating wrath. The father who had indulged him was officially dead. The CEO was back, and I was going to war. I told Jonathan I would be at his office by 5 in the morning, and ended the call. Placing my phone on the polished mahogany desk, I leaned back in my leather chair. The silence of the house pressed against my ears like a physical weight. Digging deep into the main corporate vault. Those words spoken by my attorney echoed continuously through my mind. They were not just content taking the $1.2 million I had transferred for my granddaughter's future. They were systematically dismantling the financial foundations of Mitchell Global Supply. My son was actively raiding the empire I built. I closed my eyes and let out a long, measured breath. The initial shock was beginning to fade away completely, replaced by a cold, analytical clarity. I needed to map out how they managed to orchestrate such a massive deception right under my nose. I was a man who noticed everything. In business, a misplaced decimal point or a slight hesitation in a vendor's voice would trigger my suspicion. Yet I completely missed a multi-million-dollar heist executed by my own flesh and blood. How did they blind me so effectively? I opened my eyes and looked at the framed photograph of Sarah resting on the corner of my desk. Her warm, confident smile stared back at me. That was the answer. They had used her. They had weaponized my grief and my age to construct a perfect psychological cage around me. The emotional manipulation was far more insidious than the financial theft. They knew I would never question anything that involved protecting the family from unnecessary stress. The second massive lie clicked into place with sickening precision. I cast my memory back to a Tuesday afternoon exactly 3 months ago. The wedding was supposed to be rapidly approaching, but the house was incredibly quiet. I had not received any updates about catering selections, venue deposits, or guest lists. As a man who spent his life managing complex global supply chains, the lack of logistical chatter made me inherently anxious. I had called Bradley that morning and asked him to set up a meeting with the wedding planner. I wanted to review the arrangements and ensure Harper was getting the absolute best service possible. Bradley had sounded slightly panicked on the phone, offering a vague excuse about the planner being unavailable. 2 hours later, my doorbell rang. It was not Bradley or the wedding planner. It was Monica. She stepped into my foyer wearing a beige cashmere sweater and an expression of profound distress. I led her into the formal living room and offered her a cup of tea. She declined, sitting on the edge of the velvet sofa with her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Her eyes were red and watery. She looked like a mother carrying an unbearable emotional burden. "Dad?" She began, her voice trembling with manufactured fragility. "I came over because we need to talk about the wedding. Harper is just so incredibly overwhelmed right now. She is crying every single night, and we do not know what to do." I had immediately leaned forward, my protective instincts flaring up. I asked her what was wrong, assuming there was an issue with a vendor or a problem with the bridal party. Monica let out a shaky breath and produced a single perfect tear that rolled slowly down her cheek. It was a masterful performance. "She does not want a massive spectacle," Dad, Monica said, wiping her eye. "She is terrified of the stress. All these expectations and grand plans are making her incredibly anxious. She broke down crying last night. She told us she only wants a tiny 20-person backyard dinner with immediate family and close friends. Nothing formal. Nothing exhausting." I had sat back, surprised by the sudden change in direction. I told Monica that I had already allocated significant funds to give Harper a fairy tale event. I insisted that we could hire more staff to handle the stress, so Harper would not have to lift a finger. But Monica shook her head rapidly, reaching out to place her warm hand over mine. "It is not just about Harper," she whispered, her voice dropping to a soft, sympathetic pitch. "Dad, we are so incredibly worried about you. You have been so tired lately. Losing Sarah took such a massive toll on your heart and your stamina. A huge society wedding with hundreds of guests would be exhausting for you. We cannot bear the thought of putting your health at risk just to host a party. Harper wants it small because she wants you to be comfortable and safe. We just want to protect you." I sat in my dark office tonight, remembering how those poisoned words had made me feel. They had wrapped their betrayal in a blanket of fake filial piety. They used the devastating loss of my wife to convince me that I was a fragile, broken old man who needed to be shielded from the world. They preyed on my deepest insecurities. Since Sarah passed away, I had felt a lingering exhaustion that made the world seem heavier. Monica took that natural grief and twisted it into a narrative of physical and mental decline. She made me believe that my own granddaughter was scaling back her dreams purely out of concern for my failing health. My response that afternoon 3 months ago now felt like a dagger twisting in my ribs. I had swallowed the lie completely. I had patted Monica's hand and told her not to worry. I told her that if Harper wanted a quiet 20-person backyard dinner, then that is exactly what she would get. I promised to step back completely, to stop asking about the planning, and to let them handle the small, intimate gathering without any pressure from the corporate patriarch. I gave them total, unconditional space. I handed them the shadows they needed to operate without my supervision. I wrote the check, and I walked away believing I was being a supportive and understanding father. The psychological warfare was brilliant. By convincing me that I was too old and too emotionally fragile to participate, they effectively neutralized my oversight. I stopped asking questions. I stopped requesting receipts. I stopped contacting the vendors. I sat alone in my quiet house, grieving my wife and preparing for a modest backyard barbecue. All the while, they were using my money to finance an extravagant high society gala. They used my isolation to plunder the family wealth while smiling in my face and claiming they were trying to protect my fragile heart. The anger rolling through my veins now was different from the initial shock at the hotel doors. This was a deep, sustained fury. It was the righteous anger of a man who realizes his compassion has been mocked and his legacy has been looted by the people he trusted most. I stood up from my desk and walked over to the tall windows looking out over the moonlit cobblestone streets of Beacon Hill. The pieces of their elaborate facade were crumbling one by one. The timeline was undeniably clear. They secured the $1.2 million under the guise of a federal audit panic. Then they deployed Monica to feed me the lie about the tiny 20-person dinner, ensuring I would never show up to inspect the actual preparations. They built a massive wall of deception to keep me completely in the dark. I had spent months picturing a simple gathering with paper plates and string lights in their backyard. I had even purchased a new casual suit to match the laid-back atmosphere they described so vividly. I had prepared a beautiful, heartfelt speech about the beauty of intimate family moments and the joy of simple love. I had trusted them completely to protect her heart. I believed they were shielding a young woman from the crushing weight of societal expectations. I genuinely thought they were being good parents. Instead, they were using her most sacred day as a massive financial smokescreen for their own corporate espionage. They took the purity of her marriage and absolutely stained it with their unrelenting greed. Every single smile they flashed me was a carefully calculated distraction. Every sympathetic touch was a deliberate misdirection meant to keep me completely blind to their true actions and their ultimate goal. But a burning question remained hovering in the quiet air of my office. It gnawed persistently at the very edges of my analytical mind, demanding to be answered immediately. I turned the painful events of the evening over and over, trying desperately to reconcile the conflicting realities. I had literally just returned from the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in downtown Boston. I had stood in front of the heavy grand ballroom doors. I had seen the hundreds of wealthy guests mingling under massive crystal chandeliers. I had smelled the thousands of dollars worth of imported floral arrangements. I had witnessed a spectacle of absolute opulence funded entirely by my own stolen money. I stared at my reflection in the dark window glass, my jaw set in stone. If the wedding was truly supposed to be a tiny 20-person backyard dinner designed to protect my fragile health, then why was I just locked out of a 200-guest black tie gala at the Ritz-Carlton? The immediate answer to that very specific question brought a secondary, highly sinister realization crashing down upon me. As I sat in the dim light of my office, my mind began to retrace the timeline of the past few months. I had been focused on the financial manipulation, the forged documents, and the missing $1.2 million. But a far more painful detail suddenly gripped my chest. When was the last time I had actually spoken directly to my granddaughter? I mentally scanned through my recent memories, trying to pinpoint the sound of Harper's voice. The result made my stomach turn. It had been nearly 3 full months since I had a direct conversation with her. Every single attempt I ever made to reach out to her had been flawlessly intercepted. Whenever I actually called Harper, her cell phone would ring endlessly before clicking directly to voicemail. Almost immediately after leaving a message, my phone would buzz with an incoming call from Monica. She always had a perfectly reasonable excuse ready. "Dad, Harper is so sorry she missed your call," Monica would say, her tone dripping with manufactured warmth. "She is in Europe for a startup retreat. The time difference is brutal, and she is in back-to-back meetings." A few weeks later, when I tried to call again, Monica answered Harper's phone directly. "Richard, I am just holding her phone for the week," she explained. "Harper is doing a complete digital detox. The wedding planning was causing her massive anxiety, so her therapist recommended she disconnect entirely from screens. We are just trying to keep her stress levels down." I accepted those excuses without a single second thought. I respected the boundaries they drew for me because I believed they were genuinely looking out for her mental health. I wanted her to succeed, to build her enterprise without the overbearing shadow of her grandfather looming over her. I thought I was giving her the space she needed to thrive. Instead, I allowed them to build an impenetrable fortress around me. They orchestrated a complete communication blackout. By feeding me these continuous lies, Bradley and Monica severed my only direct line to the person I loved most. They isolated me completely, ensuring Harper and I could never compare notes and never accidentally uncover the massive deception they were running in the background. It was a classic corporate quarantine tactic executed perfectly, but I was definitely not entirely helpless in this situation. I may be 70 years old, but running a global logistics empire requires a firm understanding of digital intelligence. If they built a digital wall to keep me out, I simply needed to find a back door. I leaned forward and pulled my laptop closer. I opened a private browser window. I knew Harper was highly active on social media, documenting her journey as an entrepreneur. I typed in her handle and hit enter. The screen loaded, but instead of her photo grid, a blank profile page appeared with a simple padlock icon. They had blocked my personal accounts from her page entirely to maintain their quarantine. I did not let frustration slow me down. I quickly opened a new tab and navigated to a generic email provider. Within 5 minutes, I generated a completely anonymous email address. I used that address to register a brand new, untraceable profile on the social media platform. I chose a random landscape for the profile picture and typed in a fictitious name. It was a burner account, a simple ghost in the machine, but it was all the leverage I needed to bypass their digital barricade. I typed Harper's handle into the search bar of my anonymous account and clicked the search icon. This time, the firewall crumbled. Her page loaded instantly, revealing a chronological grid of her life. The very first thing I quickly noticed was the location tags. There were no cobblestone streets of Europe. There were no startup retreats in distant countries. Every single photograph was geotagged right here in the Boston area. I clicked on a photo posted 6 weeks ago, around the time Monica had sworn Harper was across the Atlantic. The image showed my granddaughter smiling brightly outside a popular cafe in Cambridge, holding a coffee cup, the familiar brick facades clearly visible in the background. The caption read, "Loving the autumn vibes in the city today. So much to plan, but so excited for the future." I kept scrolling, the betrayal deepening with every click. I moved to the period when Monica claimed Harper was undergoing a strict digital detox. The lie shattered completely. During that exact 2-week window, Harper had posted nearly every single day. There were pictures of cake tastings, dress fittings, and floral arrangements. She was not disconnected from screens. She was highly active, deeply engaged in planning the very wedding I was paying for. but from which I had been excluded. I saw a picture of her looking at imported white orchids, the exact flowers from the invoice I had discovered. She was right here in the city, fully connected, while her parents kept me isolated. The sheer scale of the manipulation was breathtaking. They had managed two entirely separate realities with flawless execution. To Harper, they painted a picture of a busy, successful wedding preparation. To me, they painted a picture of an overwhelmed, fragile girl who needed total isolation. They stood right in the absolute middle, perfectly controlling the entire flow of information, hoarding the money, and ensuring the two sides never met. As I scrolled closer to the present day, searching desperately for any mention of the wedding itself, the anger I felt began to morph into a chilling sense of dread. I reached the most recent posts uploaded in the last 48 hours. There were beautiful shots of the rehearsal dinner, images of her smiling bridesmaids, and a video of Bradley giving a toast. But it was the post from yesterday afternoon, less than 24 hours before I stood in my tuxedo at the doors of the Ritz-Carlton, that made the blood run cold in my veins. It was a candid photograph of Harper sitting alone by a window, looking softly into the distance. The caption below the picture read, "So incredibly sad that Grandpa is too sick to make it to my big day tomorrow. He is fighting so hard, and I am praying for his recovery every minute. I love you, Grandpa. I know you will be there in spirit. Sick. Praying for his recovery. Fighting so hard." The words burned into my retinas. I am 70 years old, but I am in peak physical condition. I run 3 miles every morning without fail. I manage a global corporate portfolio with absolute precision. I am not sick. I am not fighting for my recovery. I stared at the bright screen, my breath catching in my throat, as the true, horrifying depth of their deception finally revealed itself in full. What exactly did my son and daughter-in-law tell my innocent granddaughter? The horrifying question hung in the quiet air of my office like a physical weight pressing down on my chest. What exactly did my son and daughter-in-law tell my innocent granddaughter to explain my absence? My mind spun with a dozen terrifying possibilities, each one more cruel than the last. Did they tell her I was rapidly deteriorating? Did they tell her I simply did not care enough to attend the most important day of her young life? The calculated emotional violence of it all was almost too massive to process. I could easily imagine Harper standing in her white dress, looking toward the heavy wooden doors of the ballroom, waiting for a grandfather who was never going to arrive. But I could not afford to sit there paralyzed by my own sorrow. Grief is a luxury reserved for the victorious, and right now I was standing in the middle of an active war zone. I needed absolute, undeniable proof of their financial movements, and I needed it immediately. Bradley arrogantly believed he had completely severed my digital access to the family wealth. He thought he had efficiently locked me out of the modern banking portals, the sleek new financial applications, and the shared trust dashboards we had established over the past decade. But my son severely underestimated the institutional knowledge of a man who built a global empire with his own 2 hands. He forgot about the architectural foundations of Mitchell Global Supply. He forgot about the legacy servers. Back in the late 90s, when Sarah and I first digitized our corporate infrastructure, we had created a master administrative email account. It was a digital failsafe, an archaic master key designed to automatically receive blind carbon copies of major vendor contracts and high-level financial approvals tied to the original corporate trust architecture. We had not actively used that specific server interface in over 15 years. Bradley, being of a generation that relies entirely on cloud-based convenience, never even knew the ghost server existed. I leaned forward and opened a secure terminal on my laptop. I typed in the ancient web address, my fingers moving across the keyboard strictly from ingrained muscle memory. I entered the complex alphanumeric password that I had memorized 2 decades ago. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before loading a painfully outdated gray interface. It felt like stepping into a digital graveyard, but the system was fully functional. I clicked on the master administrative inbox. My heart hammered against my ribs as endless lines of automated text began to populate the screen. There were tens of thousands of unread automated logs, but I did not need to endlessly scroll through all of them. I typed a few highly specific keywords into the search bar. Ritz-Carlton, wedding, Bradley, escrow. The old system churned for a few agonizing seconds, the processing icon spinning slowly. Then a single forwarded email appeared at the very top of the list. It was an automated receipt generated by a primary vendor and routed through our old trust approval matrix simply because Bradley had foolishly used the original routing numbers linked to the escrow account he had pressured me to fund. I clicked on the message and a high-resolution document opened on my screen. It was an official invoice from an extremely exclusive luxury florist located in the wealthiest shopping district of Boston. I stared intently at the bold black numbers printed at the bottom of the page. The total amount billed for a single evening was exactly $45,000. I leaned back in my heavy leather chair and let out a harsh, completely humorless laugh that echoed against the silent walls of my office. $45,000. The itemized list detailed hundreds of imported white orchids, cascading floral ceiling arches, and custom silver table centerpieces designed for a massive ballroom. The sheer, unadulterated audacity of their lie was absolutely staggering. Just 3 months ago, Monica had sat on the edge of my velvet sofa, wiping away those delicate, perfectly timed tears. She had sworn to my face that Harper was suffering from crippling social anxiety. She had painted a remarkably vivid picture of a tiny 20-person backyard dinner with simple paper plates and rustic string lights. She had looked me dead in the eyes and weaponized my protective concern for my granddaughter just to keep me safely locked away in my house. But you absolutely do not spend $45,000 on imported white orchids for a quiet family barbecue. You spend that kind of aggressive money when you are decorating a grand luxury ballroom to impress the most powerful and wealthy people in the city. The plausible lie they had constructed was completely annihilated in an instant. The delicate narrative they had carefully spoon-fed me to keep me isolated was nothing but a cheap theatrical production. My gut feeling, that restless, primal instinct that had kept me alive in the ruthless corporate world for 40 long years, had been entirely correct. The $1.2 million I had wired into Bradley's account was never intended to protect my assets from a fabricated federal audit. It was never intended to fund Harper's new business venture or give her a modest start in life. It was a massive, systematic extraction of my wealth right under my trusting nose. They had stolen my life savings to throw the social event of the decade, all while painting me to the outside world as a fragile, senile old man who was too sick and confused to even walk out of his front door. I looked back at the glowing screen, tracing the line items on the floral invoice with a growing sense of dangerous clarity. My eyes scanned past the ridiculous, exorbitant charges for crystal vases and decorative silk drapery. I scrolled down to the billing details section at the very bottom of the document. I needed to see exactly how Bradley had routed the massive payment to the florist. As I read the typed address, my breath suddenly caught in my throat. The cold logic of the situation fractured, revealing a truth far more terrifying and dangerous than simple vanity or typical greed. The billing address listed on the $45,000 floral invoice did not belong to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. It did not belong to Bradley and Monica's sprawling estate in the suburbs. It did not even belong to the dummy shell company they had used to secure the fraudulent power of attorney from me. The address, printed in crisp black ink, was located on State Street, right in the beating heart of the Boston financial district. It was an address I recognized instantly from my decades of corporate warfare. It belonged to an elite, highly aggressive venture capital firm known globally for executing hostile takeovers and ruthlessly liquidating legacy companies. They were absolute predators who fed on vulnerable family businesses without any mercy. Why in the world was my own flesh and blood son routing a massive wedding floral invoice through a ruthless venture capital firm that specialized exclusively in destroying corporate empires? The question hung in the cold air of my office like a guillotine waiting to drop. Venture capital firms of that aggressive nature do not care about imported orchids or luxury weddings. They care about hostile takeovers. They care about liquidating assets and dismantling legacy companies piece by piece. Mitchell Global Supply was a privately held fortress. I held the absolute controlling interest. There was only one possible way a predatory firm could ever get their hands on my company. They would need the controlling shareholder to willingly step down, or they would need the controlling shareholder to be declared legally incompetent to manage his own affairs. That single terrifying thought was the master key that finally unlocked a deeply unsettling memory from just 2 weeks ago. The pieces of their sinister puzzle began colliding in my mind with brutal force. I leaned away from the glowing laptop screen as the memory washed over me so vivid and chilling that it made my pulse pound heavily against my temples. 2 weeks ago, Bradley had come over to the house for what I thought was a routine Sunday morning coffee. Monica was with him, hovering nearby with that same cloying, manufactured concern she had weaponized so effectively. They sat me down at the kitchen island, and Bradley placed his hand over mine. He had looked at me with an expression of profound, agonizing worry. He told me that he and Monica had been observing me closely since Sarah passed away. He said I was repeating myself during conversations. He claimed I was leaving doors unlocked, forgetting minor details about corporate accounts, and staring off into space for hours. He painted a picture of a man rapidly losing his grip on reality. I had vigorously defended myself. I told them I was perfectly fine, just tired and grieving. But Monica had chimed in, her voice trembling with that trademark fake emotion. She said they had already taken the liberty of scheduling a comprehensive cognitive evaluation at Massachusetts General Hospital. She framed it as a simple routine checkup, just to give everyone some peace of mind before the stress of the wedding. They insisted they would not take no for an answer. They cornered me with their faux love, making me feel like a stubborn, aging burden if I refused to comply with their wishes, so I went. I sat in the sterile, brightly lit examination room at Mass General while a highly respected neurologist ran me through a battery of extensive cognitive tests. I answered memory prompts, solved complex spatial reasoning puzzles, and discussed my daily routine in granular detail. Bradley and Monica waited out in the corridor, supposedly wringing their hands with anxiety over my declining mental state. After nearly 2 hours of rigorous testing, the neurologist smiled warmly and handed me my file. He told me that my cognitive function was completely flawless. He said my mind was as sharp as a man half my age, and my memory retention was in the highest possible percentile. He assured me there was absolutely zero evidence of dementia, Alzheimer's, or any other cognitive decline. I had felt a massive wave of relief wash over me. I thanked the doctor, gathered my coat, and walked out into the corridor to share the wonderful news with my son and daughter-in-law. I expected to see tears of joy. I expected a tight embrace and a heavy sigh of collective relief from the family that claimed to be so desperately worried about my health. But as I stepped out of the examination room, I did not immediately call out to them. I caught their reflection in the heavy glass door of the adjacent clinic. They were standing near the elevator bank, whispering furiously to each other. They had not seen me approach. I watched their faces in the reflection, and what I saw chilled me to the absolute core of my being. There was no relief on Bradley's face. There was pure, unadulterated fury. His jaw was clenched so tightly, the muscles bulged, and his face was flushed with dark red anger. Monica was gripping his arm, her eyes wide with absolute panic. She was shaking her head rapidly, her mouth forming panicked words that I could not hear through the glass. They looked like two criminals whose master plan had just been catastrophically derailed. When I pushed the door open and announced my perfect bill of health, their expressions shifted instantly. The fury vanished, replaced by tight, incredibly forced smiles and hollow congratulations. At the time, I had dismissed their strange behavior as residual stress. I told myself they were simply overwhelmed by the emotional roller coaster of the hospital visit. But sitting here tonight, armed with the knowledge of the dummy corporation, the stolen wedding funds, and the involvement of a predatory venture capital firm, The truth was blindingly obvious. Why would a son be furious that his 70-year-old father does not have dementia? Why would a daughter-in-law panic at the news of my perfect cognitive health? Because they needed me to be sick. They desperately needed that doctor to declare me mentally unfit. If I had failed that cognitive exam, Bradley would have used the fraudulent power of attorney he tricked me into signing to seize immediate total control of Mitchell Global Supply. He would have used my medical diagnosis to bypass the board of directors and hand the keys of my empire directly to the venture capital firm on State Street. The $1.2 million was just the down payment for their corporate treason. The fake backyard dinner was designed to keep me isolated while they finalized the hostile takeover behind my back. They were trying to medically and legally erase me. My hands were shaking not from fear, but from a towering righteous rage. I turned my attention back to the laptop. If they were willing to go to such extreme lengths to manufacture a diagnosis, they would not have stopped after one failed hospital visit. They would have looked for another angle, another weakness to exploit in my medical history. I opened a new browser tab and navigated directly to the secure patient portal for my primary healthcare provider. I typed in my credentials, bypassed the two-factor authentication on my phone, and accessed my private medical dashboard. The portal contained decades of my medical history, including the intense grief counseling sessions I had attended immediately after Sarah died. Those sessions were highly confidential, documenting my deepest moments of vulnerability and depression. I navigated away from the main health summary and clicked on the Security and Access Log tab at the bottom of the screen. The system generated a detailed list showing every single time my medical records had been accessed, requested, or viewed. I scrolled past my own recent logins and the authorized access stamps from my primary care physician. Then my eyes locked onto a cluster of unauthorized activity from 3 days ago. There were 3 distinct aggressive attempts to bypass the security firewall and download my complete psychiatric evaluation records. The system had blocked the downloads and logged the source of the intrusion. I highlighted the numeric IP address listed next to the failed attempts. I quickly ran the numbers through a basic network tracing tool. The physical location attached to the IP address populated on the screen in bright red text. It did not originate from a hospital. It did not originate from an insurance company. It originated from the exact residential network hub registered to Bradley and Monica's sprawling suburban home. The digital footprint staring back at me from the bright monitor was the final absolute confirmation I needed. My own son and daughter-in-law had not only stolen my money, but were actively trying to steal my sovereignty. They were methodically building a false paper trail to strip me of my rights and my freedom. I sat in the silence of my office as the darkness gave way to morning. I felt no fatigue. My adrenaline was a cold, calculated fuel. Decades ago, when a corporate competitor tried to bankrupt me, I did not react with rage. I let them believe they were winning while I bought their supply chain from underneath them. I needed that strategy now. I could not just confront them. If they knew I was aware of their conspiracy, they would accelerate their sinister timeline. They had proven they were capable of manufacturing a crisis. I needed to give them a false sense of absolute victory so they would drop their guard completely. I walked into the adjoining bathroom and splashed cold water on my face. Looking in the mirror, I practiced the posture of the fragile man they desperately wanted me to be. I let my shoulders slump. I softened my eyes, allowing a vacant, lost expressions to settle over my features. I cleared my throat, making it sound raspy and weak. I was 70, and although I ran 3 miles every day, I knew how to mimic frailty. I walked back into the office and picked up my phone. It was past 8 in the morning. Bradley and Monica would be waking up with champagne hangovers basking in the glow of their stolen triumph. I took one final deep breath to steady my racing heart and tapped my son's name on the glass screen. The phone rang 3 times before it connected. "Hello," Bradley answered, his voice sounding groggy and slightly guarded. He was bracing himself for an angry confrontation about the Ritz-Carlton doors. I did not give him the chance to play defense. I let out a long, trembling sigh and made my voice sound incredibly small and disoriented. "Son," I whispered, injecting a note of desperate panic into my tone. "Son, is that you? I am confused. Did the wedding happen already? I think I sat down after dinner last night and just fell asleep. Did I miss Harper's big day?" There was a sharp, stunned silence on the other end of the line. I could hear his mental gears grinding. He had been preparing for a furious corporate titan demanding answers about hotel security. Instead, he was getting a pathetic, senile old man who did not even remember leaving his house. I squeezed my eyes shut and forced my voice to crack. "I am so sorry, Bradley." I continued, sounding absolutely heartbroken and utterly defeated. I laid out my suit, but I just felt so tired. My head has been so foggy lately. Please tell me I did not ruin the small backyard dinner. When Bradley finally spoke, the defensive tension was completely gone from his voice. It was instantly replaced by a thick, syrupy layer of pure condescension. "Oh, Dad," he sighed, sounding exactly like a parent talking to a toddler. "It is completely fine. We were wondering where you were, but Monica said you were probably exhausted from all the grief. You have been so confused lately." I gripped the edge of my desk so hard my knuckles turned white, but I kept my voice perfectly pathetic. "Was it beautiful?" I asked weakly. "Did she have a quiet time in the backyard?" "It was perfect," Dad Bradley replied, his lie slipping effortlessly through his teeth. "Just 20 people. Very simple, very quiet. Harper wore a cotton dress and we had a family barbecue. She missed you, of course, but she understood. We all know you are not yourself these days. You need to rest. You need to stop worrying about anything complex or stressful." I wanted to scream. I wanted to tell him about the $45,000 floral invoice and the 200 guests dancing under crystal chandeliers while I sat alone in the dark. I wanted to rip the phone apart, but I played the senile fool exactly as they needed me to. "I am just so tired, son," I murmured, letting my voice trail off into a weak, fragile whisper. "I do not know what is wrong with my old memory. I feel like I am losing my mind. Thank you for understanding. Thank you for taking care of everything for me." "Do not worry about a single thing," Dad Bradley said, his tone swelling with arrogant pride. "Monica and I have everything completely under control. You just stay in the house and rest. We will come by and see you in a few days to sort out your new schedule. Just relax." I thanked him profusely, apologizing for my failing memory before saying goodbye. I waited for the distinct electronic click of the call disconnecting, but the click never came. Bradley, in his hungover state, had pulled the phone away from his ear, but had failed to press the red button to end the call properly. The line remained open. I stood frozen in my home office, barely daring to breathe, as the background noises of his master bedroom drifted through the tiny speaker. I heard the rustle of expensive silk sheets and the soft, heavy thud of the cell phone being tossed onto a wooden nightstand. Then I heard Monica's voice, muffled but perfectly clear. "Was that him?" she asked, her tone sharp and alert. "Was he furious about the security guards last night?" I pressed the phone tighter against my ear. Bradley let out a cruel, booming laugh that sent a shiver of absolute physical disgust straight down my spine. "Furious." Bradley scoffed, his voice dripping with victorious, utter contempt. "He does not even remember going to the hotel. He thinks he fell asleep in his reading chair and missed a simple backyard barbecue. I told you the isolation would break him down. He was crying, apologizing for his bad memory. He is completely lost." There was a brief, agonizing pause, and then Monica let out a deeply satisfied sigh. "It is perfect," she said smoothly. "I was so worried we would have to fight him on the transfer of corporate power, but this development makes it so much easier. The old man's brain is finally turning to mush, just like we needed it to." I closed my eyes, absorbing the sheer toxic venom of their casual morning conversation. They were celebrating my supposed mental decay. They were rejoicing in the illusion that I was a broken, defenseless creature who could no longer protect himself or defend his legacy. "Call the clinic," Bradley commanded, his voice suddenly turning cold and brutally efficient. Tell them we are moving the timeline up right now. We do not need to wait around for the end of the month. He is totally compliant. Tell them we are coming in to sign the permanent guardianship papers, and then we finally move him permanently on Tuesday." The line went dead. I slowly lowered the phone from my ear and placed it flat on my mahogany desk. I sat completely frozen in the silence for a long time. The sheer magnitude of their betrayal settled deep into my bones. "We move him on Tuesday." The words echoed in the silent room. They had scheduled the complete erasure of my autonomy. In 48 hours, they intended to strip away my legal rights, force me into a psychiatric clinic, and lock me away under the guise of cognitive decline. They wanted to bury me alive. The shock of their cruelty evaporated, replaced by a profound, terrifying calm. I was no longer a grieving widower, and I was no longer an indulgent father. I was the founder of Mitchell Global Supply, and my own son had declared a hostile takeover of my life. I went upstairs, showered, and put on my tailored charcoal suit. I tied my silk tie with deliberate movements. I took the keys to the heavy sedan and drove through the empty, sleeping city streets. The roads were damp from a light morning mist. My mind operated with maximum efficiency, calculating angles and anticipating their next moves. I arrived at the skyscraper that housed Pierce and Associates shortly before 5 in the morning. The lobby was deserted except for a solitary security guard, who nodded silently as I swiped my access card at the private elevator bank. The doors slid shut and I ascended to the 42nd floor. The elevator chimed and I stepped into the hushed reception area. Jonathan Pierce was already waiting in the main corridor. He wore a crisp white shirt with the sleeves rolled up, and his dark eyes were sharp. We had been down in the corporate trenches together far too many times for useless pleasantries. He gestured for me to follow, leading me directly into a secure, soundproof conference room located at the very back of the executive suite. The heavy oak door clicked shut behind us, instantly sealing us off. The long glass conference table was covered in thick stacks of financial documents, bank logs, and legal folios. Jonathan poured 2 cups of black coffee from a silver carafe and pushed one across the glass toward me. I sat down and told him everything. I recounted the agonizing phone call, the massive floral invoice linked to the venture capital firm, and the chilling conversation I had just overheard about the clinic and the Tuesday deadline. Jonathan listened with the stoic expression of a seasoned war general. He took a slow sip of his coffee, absorbing the treachery. When I finished, Jonathan set his cup down and reached for a thick manila folder resting at the center of the table. "Richard," he said, his voice dropping to a low register, "you and I have survived corporate espionage, federal investigations, and vicious market crashes. Do you honestly believe I would let you sign away your sovereign wealth without a massive insurance policy?" He opened the folder and extracted a copy of the temporary power of attorney that Bradley had panicked me into signing 6 months ago. The document looked exactly as I remembered it. Jonathan flipped past the first dozen pages until he reached page 48. He smoothed the paper flat against the table and pointed to a dense paragraph buried deep within the complex legal architecture. "When Bradley brought this document into your office," Jonathan explained, speaking with surgical precision, "he thought he was incredibly clever. He assumed he could rush you into signing a blanket authorization by playing on your paternal instincts. But your son completely failed to realize that our firm drafts every single piece of family estate paperwork with interlocking contingency clauses. I embedded a specific poison pill right here in subsection 9. I leaned forward, scanning the text. The legal jargon was dense, but Jonathan translated it swiftly. "This clause explicitly states that any unilateral transfer of funds exceeding $100,000 to any offshore entity or unauthorized holding account requires your physical biometric thumbprint authorization. If the designated proxy attempts to force a transfer of that magnitude without your physical presence, the power of attorney is instantly invalidated." I stared at him, the brilliance of his trap washing over me. "You built a tripwire," I whispered. "Exactly." Jonathan nodded, a predatory smile touching his mouth. "It is a silent alarm." The moment Bradley tried to move the $1.2 million, the banking system flagged it. It allowed the transfer to process superficially, giving him a false sense of victory, but it immediately triggered an absolute administrative freeze on every single asset connected to his name. The trap snapped shut the second he hit the transfer button. He thinks he won, I said, the cold reality settling in. He thinks he has the power to declare me incompetent by Tuesday because he believes the document is active. Jonathan nodded. He is operating under a shattered illusion. The document is void. He has absolutely no legal authority over your health, your estate, or your corporate holdings. He cannot move you to a clinic, and he cannot touch your shares. The power of attorney self-destructed the moment he tried to steal the money. We gave him enough rope to hang himself, and he sprinted straight for the gallows. We sat in silence for a moment. My son had walked right into our trap, blinded by his own arrogance. He spent the last 6 months celebrating a successful heist, unaware that he was standing on a financial landmine. The corporate machinery I spent 4 decades building was protecting me, even when my own blood was trying to tear me down. But there was one final piece to the puzzle. The poison pill had neutralized Bradley's legal authority, but the funds had still been superficially routed. The money moved before the freeze fully locked the accounts down. The floral invoice proved that Bradley was actively bleeding the trust, but the connection to the venture capital firm suggested a much deeper conspiracy. If the money was not going toward the wedding, and it was not sitting in Harper's business account, where exactly had my son diverted my life savings? I looked up at Jonathan. The trap worked, I said, keeping my voice steady. But where did the money go? Jonathan's expression darkened. The predatory smile vanished, replaced by a look of grave concern. He reached into his leather briefcase resting on the floor and pulled out a sleek black dossier. He placed it carefully onto the glass table, his hand resting firmly on top of the cover. We spent the entire night tracking the digital routing numbers, Jonathan said, his voice barely above a whisper. Bradley did not just wire that money to himself, Richard. He did not use it to pay off personal debts, and he certainly did not secure it for your granddaughter. He slid the black dossier slowly across the polished glass table until it rested directly in front of me. Richard, Jonathan said, his eyes locking onto mine with absolute severity. Look, where he sent the $1.2 million. I opened the heavy black cover of the dossier. The first page was a complex flowchart mapping a labyrinth of international wire transfers. Jonathan reached over and tapped a specific red box situated at the very end of the digital trail. The $1.2 million had not simply vanished into the domestic banking ether. It had bounced through 3 different proxy accounts in Delaware and Nevada before launching across the ocean. It landed squarely in a secure, untraceable offshore account located in the Cayman Islands. The name of the holding company was registered as Sterling Crest Holdings. The name meant absolutely nothing to me at first glance. But Jonathan flipped to the next page, revealing the corporate registration documents retrieved by his elite private investigators. The managing director of Sterling Crest Holdings was listed as Monica Vance. Vance was the maiden name of Monica. My son had completely bypassed the traditional safeguards of our family trust by using his wife's premarital identity to set up an offshore shell company. They had carefully orchestrated the panic of a fake federal audit simply to funnel my life savings into an account that lay completely outside the jurisdiction of the United States tax authorities. I stared at the offshore banking records as a cold fury settled over my mind. But the money was just the beginning of their deception. I turned the page and found a detailed guest list from the event at the Ritz-Carlton tonight. I looked at Jonathan, demanding an explanation for the sheer volume of wealthy strangers I had seen through the glass doors. Jonathan leaned back in his chair, his expression grave. "Richard," he said, his voice steady. "That event at the hotel was not a wedding reception. Harper and her husband had a brief 15-minute ceremony in the courtyard, but the massive gathering in the grand ballroom was something else entirely. It was a corporate networking gala. Bradley used the $45,000 in imported white orchids and the hundreds of thousands in catering to throw an opulent party for the most aggressive venture capitalists in the Northeast. He used his granddaughter's wedding as a spectacular, glittering smokescreen to court the exact predators who want to dismantle Mitchell Global Supply. I looked down at the list. Every name belonged to a ruthless corporate liquidator, a hostile takeover specialist, or a partner at the State Street venture capital firm. Bradley had charged the entire evening to the corporate accounts using my money to host a lavish banquet for the people preparing to destroy my life work. He made sure I stayed home isolated by my grief and expecting a small backyard dinner so I would never see him shaking hands with the enemy. He paraded his beautiful daughter in her white dress to present an image of perfect family stability, convincing the investors that the Mitchell empire was ripe for the picking and that he was the man firmly in charge. The magnitude of the betrayal made the air in the soundproof conference room feel incredibly thin. I took a deep breath, forcing my lungs to expand. "Why are they courting liquidators?" I asked, my voice dropping to a dangerous, terrifying whisper. If Bradley wants to take over the company, why is he inviting the exact people who will tear it apart and sell it for scraps? Jonathan slid another heavily redacted document across the glass table. "Because he does not want to run your company, Richard. He never wanted to load shipping containers, manage international logistics, or negotiate with port authorities. He only wants the cash. This is a preliminary letter of intent drafted by the State Street firm. Bradley has spent the last 6 months secretly negotiating the total liquidation of Mitchell Global Supply. He agreed to sell the entire enterprise out from under you for exactly $50 million. I stared at the numbers printed on the crisp white paper. $50 million. It was a fraction of what the company was truly worth, a fire sale price designed to secure a rapid, unquestioned buyout. Bradley had realized that even with a fabricated psychiatric hold, the board of directors would eventually uncover his incompetence if he tried to actually run the logistics empire. He knew he could never fill my shoes, so instead of trying to lead the company, he decided to completely destroy it. His grand plan was to secure the power of attorney, lock me away in a secure medical clinic by Tuesday, and immediately authorize the hostile sale of my life's work. Once the $50 million hit his accounts, he and Monica were going to immediately transfer the entire sum into the Cayman Islands Shell Company. Jonathan confirmed my darkest suspicion. "They have already purchased one-way first-class tickets, Richard. As soon as the liquidation funds clear, they are flying straight to a non-extradition country in South America. They plan to live like absolute royalty on a stolen fortune, leaving you locked in a psychiatric ward to rot away in complete confusion and total isolation. They were going to strip away my business, my wealth, and my freedom, vanishing into the tropical sun without a single trace of remorse." I slowly closed the heavy black cover of the dossier. The pieces of the puzzle were now fully assembled. My own son was a traitor of the highest order. He had weaponized my love, exploited my grief over losing Sarah, and manipulated my innocent granddaughter, all to orchestrate the perfect crime. He thought he had navigated the complex waters of corporate law and emerged completely victorious. He firmly believed that by tomorrow, he would be holding a $50 million check while I was being sedated in a locked medical facility. I looked across the glass table at Jonathan. The seasoned attorney was watching me closely, waiting for my command. The founder of Mitchell Global Supply did not panic. I felt a surge of cold, focused energy radiating through my veins. The sorrow and the grief were completely gone, burned away by the white-hot necessity of immediate retaliation. "When exactly is the final sale scheduled to be signed?" I asked, my voice carrying the absolute authority of a man preparing for total war. Jonathan checked the heavy gold watch on his left wrist. "The State Street venture capital firm is opening their doors specifically for this transaction. The final liquidation documents are scheduled to be executed on Monday at exactly 9 in the morning." I stood up from the conference table and buttoned my tailored charcoal jacket. I smoothed my silk tie, feeling the familiar comforting weight of command settling back onto my shoulders. The trap was set, the timeline was exposed, and the enemy was currently sleeping off a champagne hangover, unaware that their master plan had just been entirely compromised. I had spent 40 years building an empire from a single rusting delivery truck. I knew every vulnerability, every legal loophole, and every hidden pressure point within my own corporation. I looked Jonathan Pierce in the eyes. I have exactly 24 hours to destroy his empire. Let us get to work. Jonathan opened his laptop, the harsh glow illuminating the sharp lines of his tired face. We did not waste a single second. The clock was ticking down to the Monday morning meeting at the venture capital firm, and we had an immense amount of complex legal restructuring to accomplish before the sun came up over the Boston skyline. Bradley believed he had successfully paralyzed my corporate authority, assuming that the fraudulent power of attorney and my supposed mental decline gave him unchallenged dominion over Mitchell Global Supply. He was operating under the arrogant assumption that a global logistics company is simply defined by its massive warehouses, its fleet of shipping trucks, and its physical inventory. But Bradley had never bothered to understand the true underlying architecture of the empire I had built. He was a creature of surface appearances, completely blinded by the illusion of physical, tangible assets. The real, unassailable value of Mitchell Global Supply did not reside in the steel shipping containers or the international distribution centers scattered across the globe. The true $50 million valuation rested entirely in our proprietary routing algorithms, the highly customized supply chain management software, and a fiercely guarded portfolio of international logistics patents. Those digital assets were the invisible nervous system that kept the entire global operation functioning with flawless precision. Without that specific software, the delivery trucks would sit idle, the automated warehouses would completely freeze, and the international shipping routes would collapse into absolute irreversible chaos. Decades ago, when I first foresaw the massive digital revolution approaching the global shipping industry, I made a crucial, completely private legal maneuver. I legally separated the intellectual property from the primary corporate structure. I registered every single algorithm, every line of proprietary code, and every core patent under a highly restricted founder designation. Bradley had arrogantly assumed he was selling a fully functioning, immensely profitable gold mine to the predatory liquidators on State Street. He had confidently promised them the keys to a kingdom he did not actually own. He had absolutely no idea that I retained the absolute unchallengeable authority to revoke the licensing rights to the essential operating software at any given moment. I was about to turn his $50 million gold mine into an empty, worthless cardboard box. "Jonathan," I said, keeping my voice completely devoid of emotion, "draft the immediate transfer protocols right now. I want every single patent, every registered copyright, and all the proprietary logistics software completely stripped away from the Mitchell Global Supply corporate umbrella immediately." "Where exactly are we moving them?" Jonathan asked, his fingers already flying across his illuminated keyboard with practiced, lethal speed. "We are moving them into a brand new, completely insulated holding entity," I replied, staring out at the dark city. "Register it immediately in Delaware. Name it Zenith Apex Holdings. Put it solely and exclusively in my name, with absolutely zero external beneficiaries and zero proxy access. Nobody breathes on these digital assets without my physical signature." Jonathan nodded once, his eyes locked intensely onto his glowing screen as he began executing the massive digital transfer. For the next 5 hours, the secure, soundproof conference room was filled only with the rapid clicking of keyboard keys and the quiet rustle of dense, heavily redacted legal documents. We worked in perfect silence, moving with the seamless, unspoken synergy of two men who had fought and won countless vicious corporate wars together over the past 20 years. We initiated emergency digital notarizations, formally transferred the international intellectual property licenses, and legally severed the operating software from the main corporate body. We systematically gutted the very core of the company, extracting its beating digital heart, and leaving behind only a hollow, useless physical shell. The process was completely untraceable to anyone operating inside the standard corporate framework. It was a surgical strike executed with absolute precision. By the time the first pale rays of morning light began to bleed through the tall glass windows of the executive suite, the massive corporate extraction was completely finalized. Jonathan pressed the final execution key, securely logging out of the global registry, and leaned back in his leather chair, rubbing his exhausted eyes. "It is officially done, Richard," he said, letting out a long, heavy breath that echoed in the quiet room. "Zenith Apex Holdings is now live, fully registered, and completely impenetrable. Every single piece of proprietary routing software and every logistics patent is safely locked away under your exclusive legal control. Mitchell Global Supply has been officially stripped of its intellectual property. If Bradley tries to finalize the corporate sale on Monday morning, he will be selling an empty shell. The venture capital firm will run their final due diligence, realize the software licenses have vanished overnight, and the entire $50 million acquisition will instantly implode. They will absolutely tear him to pieces when they realize he tried to sell them a functionally worthless company." I stared at the towering stacks of transfer documents resting on the polished glass table. A profound, icy satisfaction settled deep into my chest, easing the heavy burden of the previous night. The financial blockade was absolutely flawless. The corporate defense was impenetrable. I had successfully protected the lifeblood of my life work from my own treacherous son. The predators on State Street would walk away empty-handed, and Bradley would be left holding nothing but ashes. But as the adrenaline slowly began to recede from my veins, leaving a cold, sharp ache in my muscles, a dark, deeply unsettling realization started to take root in the back of my mind. Ruining his illicit corporate sale and cutting off his offshore financial access was simply a matter of ruthless business strategy. It protected my assets and secured my company, but it did not exact true permanent justice. Bradley had willfully conspired to strip away my fundamental freedom, isolate me cruelly from my granddaughter, and lock me inside a secure psychiatric ward to rot away in silence. He was actively planning to steal my entire life and vanish into the sunset. Simply blocking the financial sale was not nearly enough to stop him permanently. The patents and algorithms were fully secured, but I needed something much more powerful to put my own son behind bars, where he truly belonged for the rest of his miserable life. I needed a verified, irrefutable confession. I needed to know the exact specific lie he had confidently spun to those ruthless venture capitalists to justify liquidating my empire without my presence. I needed to hear him admit his treason out loud in a way that he could never deny in a court of law. I turned to Jonathan, the pale morning light casting long, sharp shadows across the polished glass table. The time for passive defensive maneuvering had officially come to a definitive end. "I need to get him in a secure room with those wealthy venture investors," I stated coldly, my voice perfectly steady in the quiet office. "I need to stand quietly in the shadows and carefully listen to him hang himself with his very own words. I need a full confession to completely destroy his false empire once and for all." Jonathan did not hesitate. He understood perfectly that my demand was not driven by emotional vengeance, but by the absolute necessity of complete legal destruction. He reached across his massive desk and pressed a single button on his secure intercom system. He instructed his security liaison to bring up the asset. Less than 5 minutes later, the heavy oak door of the conference room clicked open. A man stepped into the room. He was dressed in a gray suit that made him practically invisible. This was Marcus Jonathan's lead private investigator, a former federal operative who specialized in deep corporate espionage and invisible asset retrieval. Marcus did not offer a polite greeting. He simply walked to the table and placed a matte black flash drive precisely in front of me. The private investigator looked at me with an expression of unwavering professional respect. He explained that when Jonathan had first detected the massive unauthorized wire transfer to the escrow account, he had immediately dispatched a covert surveillance team to the Ritz-Carlton Hotel. They knew the ballroom was booked for a luxury event, but they needed to know exactly what was being discussed behind closed doors. Marcus detailed how one of his most experienced undercover operatives had successfully infiltrated the luxury catering staff. While serving champagne and passing expensive hors d'oeuvres, the operative had managed to slip a military-grade listening device under the heavy mahogany table in the primary VIP lounge adjacent to the main ballroom. That specific lounge had been strictly reserved for Bradley and the senior partners of the State Street venture capital firm. The encrypted flash drive contained the raw, completely unedited audio recording of their intensely private, premature pre-sale celebration. I slowly picked up the small black flash drive from the table. It felt incredibly unnaturally heavy in my trembling palm, like a piece of solid lead containing the final undeniable proof of my family's total annihilation. I thanked Jonathan and Marcus for their flawless execution and walked out of the law firm as the morning sun finally broke over the horizon. I drove the sedan back to my sprawling, painfully silent suburban estate. The massive stone house was completely empty, a vast, echoing monument to the life Sarah and I had built, now echoing with the hollow reality of my son's ultimate betrayal. I walked directly into my dark wood-paneled study and firmly closed the heavy double doors behind me. I did not bother to turn on the overhead lights. The only illumination came from the soft, pale sunlight filtering through the thick velvet curtains. I walked methodically over to the antique crystal decanter resting on the polished side table. My hands were surprisingly steady as I poured a generous measure of aged amber whiskey into a heavy glass tumbler. I stood there in the quiet shadows, staring at the liquid catching the dim light. I was deliberately bracing myself for the immense emotional impact of what I was about to do. This was the point of no return. Listening to the words on this encrypted drive would permanently and irreversibly sever the deep fundamental tie to my only son. It would strip away the very last shred of hope that Bradley had simply made a foolish, desperate mistake. It would confirm that the boy I had raised, the child I had protected and provided for his entire life, was a cold-blooded, calculating monster willing to discard me for a pile of cash. I took a slow, deeply burning sip of the expensive whiskey, letting the harsh heat ground me firmly in the brutal present moment. I walked over to my large executive desk and sat down in the heavy leather chair. I carefully plugged the black flash drive into the secure side port on my laptop. A complex decryption window immediately popped up on the screen, demanding the specific alphanumeric sequence Jonathan had provided me. I typed the complex code with deliberate, painfully precise keystrokes. The progress bar flashed green, and a single audio file appeared in the center of the dark monitor. The file was simply labeled with the date of the wedding and the location of the VIP lounge. I hovered the cursor over the play icon. A profound, suffocating silence filled the study. I could hear the faint, steady ticking of the grandfather clock in the hallway, marking the final seconds of my life as a trusting father. I took one last deep breath, mentally locking my heart inside a steel vault, and clicked the mouse. The audio track immediately began, with the chaotic, heavily muffled sounds of a crowded, high-end luxury venue. I could hear the faint, rhythmic thumping of the jazz band playing out in the main ballroom and the sharp, crystalline clinking of expensive glassware. Then the background noise was abruptly muted by the heavy thud of a thick wooden door closing, sealing the room in private acoustics. The digital audio cleared perfectly. There were several distinct voices in the room, men laughing and congratulating each other, in the arrogant, relaxed tone of predators who had successfully cornered their prey. I recognized the smooth, practiced voices of the State Street liquidators. They were loudly offering toasts, excitedly praising the aggressive timeline of the acquisition, and discussing the massive profit margins they expected to generate once they began carving up Mitchell Global Supply. Then Bradley spoke. His voice echoed through the high-fidelity speakers of my laptop, cutting through the dark silence of my study. He sounded incredibly relaxed, supremely confident, and absolutely overflowing with a sickening, victorious pride. He thanked the senior partners for their partnership and assured them that the final legal hurdles would be completely eliminated by Tuesday morning. A voice belonging to the lead venture capitalist cut in, asking a very specific, pointed question. The investor firmly wanted to know exactly how Bradley was managing my permanent transition out of the corporate structure. I gripped my whiskey glass so tightly I thought the crystal might shatter in my hand. I silently waited for my son to eagerly explain his fraudulent manufactured medical strategy. I waited for him to casually dismiss my life and my legacy. But what Bradley said next went far beyond a simple business lie. His response was so meticulously cruel, so deeply soaked in calculated malice, that it made the blood freeze entirely in my veins. Bradley let out a soft, dismissive chuckle. "You do not need to worry about the old man," he told the room of greedy investors, his tone dropping into a sinister, mocking whisper. "He is completely and utterly neutralized. I have been slowly adjusting his daily blood pressure medication for the past 3 months. Nothing immediately lethal, just enough to constantly cause severe disorientation, memory lapses, and chronic physical fatigue. The doctors think it is rapid onset dementia, but it is just chemical compliance. By the time I drop him off at the locked psychiatric ward on Tuesday, his mind will be so completely scrambled, he will not even remember his own name, let alone the access codes to the primary corporate accounts. The entire global empire is finally officially ours, gentlemen." The recording continued to play, the crisp audio capturing every horrifying nuance of my son's voice. He paused, letting the weight of his monstrous revelation settle over the room, before continuing his pitch with absolute chilling confidence. "Gentlemen, the company is 100% mine," Bradley declared, his tone practically vibrating with arrogance. "My father, Richard, has late-stage Alzheimer's. He is completely unhinged. Next Tuesday, I have a court order to commit him to a closed psychiatric ward. You can sign the buyout safely. The old man will be locked away in a padded room." The words slammed into the quiet atmosphere of my study like a physical blow. I stopped breathing. The glass of whiskey in my hand remained perfectly still as my mind struggled to fully process the sheer, unadulterated evil echoing from the laptop speakers. The horror of the betrayal had finally reached its absolute, terrifying peak. Bradley was not merely plotting to steal my life savings or execute a hostile takeover of Mitchell Global Supply. He was meticulously planning to steal the rest of my natural life. He intended to strip away my fundamental human rights, erase my personal autonomy, and throw me into a mental asylum where I would be left to decay in total isolation. My imagination vividly painted the grim reality he had designed for me. I pictured myself trapped in a sterile, windowless room, the heavy steel door locked securely from the outside. I envisioned the heavy chemical sedatives they would pump into my veins, forcibly turning his lie into a reality by destroying my cognitive function. I would become a ghost trapped inside my own failing body, unable to contact the outside world, unable to manage my own wealth, and unable to fight back. All the while, my own flesh and blood would be lounging on a pristine beach in the Cayman Islands, funding a life of extreme luxury with the very empire I had sacrificed decades of my life to build. The profound cruelty of his plan was almost too massive to comprehend. A son is supposed to be the guardian of his father's legacy, the one who protects him, as age slowly takes its inevitable toll. Instead, Bradley had viewed my aging as a convenient vulnerability, an opportunity to forcefully expedite my demise. He had weaponized my profound grief over losing Sarah, twisting my natural sorrow into a fabricated medical condition. The deep, agonizing sting of his betrayal tore through my chest, severing the very last emotional tie I held for him. The boy I had raised, the child I had proudly taught to ride a bicycle and supported through every single challenge in his life, simply no longer existed. In his place stood a ruthless, calculating stranger who was actively negotiating my permanent incarceration. On the recording, the venture capitalists did not react with shock or moral outrage. There were no gasps of horror or objections to his sinister methods. Instead, a chorus of low, appreciative murmurs filled the VIP lounge. These were men who specialized in corporate slaughter, and they clearly admired a predator who possessed the sheer ruthlessness to completely eliminate an obstacle, even if that obstacle was his own father. "That is a highly effective strategy," one of the senior investors remarked. his voice smooth and entirely devoid of basic human empathy. Securing the medical mandate ensures there will be absolutely zero legal friction during the asset transfer. Once he is institutionalized, the board of directors will have no choice but to recognize your total authority. We can finalize the asset acquisition smoothly. The paperwork will be drafted and ready for your signature precisely at 9 on Monday morning. Excellent, Bradley replied, the sickening sound of a champagne flute being refilled, echoing clearly through the audio feed. By the time the ink dries on the sale documents, Monica and I will be miles away. We have already finalized the offshore accounts. The transition will be completely seamless. I sat rigidly in my heavy leather chair, the dim morning light casting long shadows across my mahogany desk. The raw reality of the situation crystallized in my mind with terrifying clarity. I was completely alone in a house that my son had transformed into a trap. Every meal I had eaten, every cup of coffee Monica had so graciously poured for me, every supposedly harmless medication I had swallowed over the past 3 months, had been laced with chemical subjugation. They had been slowly poisoning me in my own home, carefully preparing me for the slaughter. My survival was no longer guaranteed by my wealth or my status. It depended entirely on my ability to strike back with overwhelming, devastating force before the Tuesday deadline. The audio recording captured the soft, rhythmic clinking of crystal glasses as the men toasted to their newly formed alliance. To the successful acquisition of Mitchell Global Supply, a voice cheered loudly. And to your early retirement, Richard Bradley added, his voice dripping with venomous mockery. I reached out with a trembling hand, preparing to press the stop button on the keyboard. I had heard enough. I had the absolute, irrefutable confession I needed to involve the federal authorities and send my son to a maximum security prison. I had the exact details of the transaction, the timeline, and the medical conspiracy. I was ready to close the laptop and make the call to Jonathan Pierce to authorize the final lethal phase of our counterattack. But as my finger hovered over the trackpad, the ambient noise on the recording suddenly shifted. The heavy, polished wooden door of the Ritz-Carlton 5-Four IP lounge creaked open instantly, silencing the jovial celebration of the investors. The sudden hush in the room was palpable, heavy with unexpected tension. Bradley, a delicate, familiar voice called out, cutting sharply through the stale air of the lounge. The sound made the blood freeze solidly in my veins. It was a voice I recognized instantly. A voice that had always brought me immense joy and comfort. A voice that belonged to a young woman who was supposedly suffering from crippling social anxiety, a girl who I thought was having a quiet, rustic barbecue in the suburbs, while this extravagant corporate networking event raged on without her. I listened, completely paralyzed in my chair, as the distinct heavy rustle of a massive silk wedding gown dragged across the hardwood floor of the VIP lounge. The soft, measured footsteps approached the center of the room. It was Harper. My innocent, beloved granddaughter had just walked directly into the private den of corporate wolves. Harper Bradley said, his tone instantly shifting from ruthless corporate predator to a warm, welcoming patriarch. What are you doing away from the main ballroom? The investors are just finalizing the last details. I wanted to make sure everything was proceeding exactly as we planned, Harper replied, her voice completely devoid of the sweet, anxious innocence she had always displayed in my presence. Her tone was sharp, cold, and dripping with an authoritative confidence that I had never heard before. I pressed the laptop speaker closer to my ear, my heart hammering violently against my ribs as the horrifying truth began to unfold. The paperwork is ready for Monday, Bradley assured her smoothly. The old man is completely sedated back at the estate. He missed the entire evening just as you predicted. Excellent, Harper said, her voice echoing clearly through the hidden microphone. Because if we are going to liquidate grandfather's empire and disappear to the islands, I need absolute confirmation that the State Street funds will clear before Tuesday morning. I am not boarding that plane until the $50 million is safely locked in our Cayman accounts. The room spun around me. The glass of whiskey slipped from my numb fingers, shattering against the hardwood floor. The betrayal was not just Bradley and Monica. The poison ran through the entire bloodline. My precious granddaughter was the architect. Or so I thought for one horrifying second. My overloaded mind had momentarily betrayed me. The cold voice demanding confirmation of the Cayman transfer was not Harper. It belonged to the venture capital partner. But the rustle of heavy silk was real. Erratic footsteps rushed into the center of the private lounge. The spacious room fell utterly silent. The clinking of expensive crystal glasses instantly stopped. The arrogant, triumphant laughter died instantly right in the throats of the corporate predators. A fragile, trembling voice pierced the toxic, cigar-scented atmosphere of the room. It was Harper. My actual, innocent granddaughter. The crushing, suffocating weight on my chest evaporated in a fraction of a second, instantly replaced by sharp, agonizing clarity as I listened to the raw, undeniable devastation in her young voice. She was completely hyperventilating, struggling deeply to catch her breath and speak clearly. "Where is he?" Harper demanded, her voice thick and heavy with uncontrollable sobbing. "Where is Grandpa? Why is he not here? You promised me he was coming. You said his car was already on the way." The anguish radiating from the speakers was absolutely genuine. There was no calculation in her tone, no hidden agenda. She was completely innocent. She was not a co-conspirator in their plot to dismantle my life. She was a pawn on their twisted chessboard, manipulated just as ruthlessly as I was. Bradley attempted to speak, but his voice lacked its arrogant swagger. He stammered, caught completely off guard by her sudden intrusion. But before he could formulate a lie to pacify her, Monica seamlessly intervened. Her voice slithered through the audio feed, dripping with a chilling sweetness that made my stomach turn sour. "Oh, sweetie," Monica cooed, her tone laced with sickening sorrow. She stepped closer to the microphone, her voice dropping to a performative whisper, designed for both Harper and the venture capitalists to hear. "Do not cry, darling. It is going to ruin your beautiful makeup. We did not want to tell you and ruin your special day, but there was an emergency at the house this morning." "What emergency?" Harper gasped, blind panic completely taking over her voice. "Is he okay? What happened to Grandpa?" Monica let out a perfectly practiced sigh of fake tragedy. "Grandpa had a medical episode this morning, sweetie," she lied, her voice smooth and steady. "He suffered a mini stroke after breakfast. The doctors came to the house. He is stable now, but it was very bad. He is disoriented, darling. He does not recognize anyone, not even your father. He cannot walk on his own." No, Harper wailed, the sharp sound of her utter heartbreak echoing painfully off the walls of my quiet study. "I need to see him. I need to leave right now." "You cannot leave," Bradley interjected, his tone suddenly firm and commanding, desperate to keep the profitable illusion perfectly intact. "He specifically asked us to keep you here. He told us he was far too ashamed of his physical condition. He could not bear the thought of his beautiful granddaughter, seeing him strapped helplessly into a medical wheelchair on her wedding day. He begged us to let you celebrate without him. He said to tell you he loves you more than anything in the world." I sat frozen in my leather chair, my hands curled into trembling fists. The pure evil of their twisted narrative was almost incomprehensible. They had deliberately used a fabricated medical emergency to permanently shatter a young bride's heart on the most important day of her life. They had weaponized my unconditional love for her, twisting it into a vile lie to justify my absence. They painted me as a humiliated old man, hiding away in shame, all to ensure Harper would not come looking for me and to convince the listening venture capitalists that I was permanently incapacitated. Suddenly, the events of the previous evening locked together with terrifying clarity. The unprecedented security presence stationed at the Ritz-Carlton doors, the strict guest list, the physical barricade that had blocked me from entering the venue. It was not just a tactic to keep me from seeing the corporate networking gala they had funded with my stolen money. It was not just about hiding the venture capitalists from my view. The entire security apparatus was specifically designed to keep Harper from seeing me. If I had walked through those brass doors in my tuxedo, standing tall and perfectly healthy, Monica's vicious lie would have disintegrated in an absolute instant. Harper would have immediately seen that I was not confined to a wheelchair. She would have seen that I had not suffered a stroke and that I recognized everyone. The entire fabricated narrative of my cognitive decline would have been completely obliterated in front of the exact investors Bradley was trying to court. They had to keep me out, and they had to keep her inside, isolated by their web of emotional manipulation. They were playing a high-stakes psychological game, utilizing my granddaughter's genuine grief as a prop to finalize the hostile takeover of Mitchell Global Supply. On the recording, Monica continued to comfort Harper, murmuring soothing lies, while gently guiding her out of the VIP lounge and back toward the main reception. The heavy wooden door clicked shut again, leaving Bradley alone with the silent investors. He immediately let out a long, exaggerated sigh of relief. "You see, gentlemen," Bradley said, his voice returning to its normal, arrogant pitch. "The family situation is tragic, but it is being handled. Now let us return to the precise terms of the liquidation." I did not need to hear another single word. I reached forward and firmly pressed the stop button on my keyboard. The encrypted audio file ceased, plunging my home office back into deep, absolute silence. I sat in the dim morning light, staring blankly at the dark monitor. The profound, suffocating sadness that had weighed down my soul for the past 6 months. The agonizing grief of losing my wife and watching my son drift away completely vanished. The sorrow was entirely gone. In its place, a pure glacial wrath settled permanently into my bones. It was a cold, mechanical determination that left no room for mercy, hesitation, or paternal forgiveness. Bradley and Monica were no longer family. They were a malignant infection that needed to be surgically excised from my life and my legacy. They had stolen my money, plotted to steal my freedom, and tortured my granddaughter for corporate gain. I reached across the mahogany desk and picked up my cell phone. My thumb scrolled rapidly through the contact list until I found her private number. The State Street venture capital firm was expecting to sign the final acquisition paperwork on Monday morning. Bradley was expecting to lock me in a psychiatric ward on Tuesday. But the entire architecture of their criminal conspiracy relied on Harper remaining completely in the dark. It relied on the false illusion of my silent, compliant decay. I pressed the green call button and raised the phone to my ear, listening to the steady ringing. It was time to tear their reality to the ground. Harper answered on the third ring. Her voice was small, choked with tears and exhaustion. She whispered a cautious hello, expecting tragic news about my condition. I kept my voice perfectly steady. I told her I needed to see her immediately in person, away from the manipulative influence of her parents. I instructed her to meet me at a quiet, obscure coffee shop on the northern edge of the city, a comfortable place we used to visit when she was a little girl. I explicitly emphasized that she must not tell Bradley or Monica where she was going under any circumstances. I could hear the deep confusion and the desperate, fragile hope warring in her brief silence before she finally agreed to my sudden request. I arrived early, choosing a secluded booth in the back corner. The Sunday crowd was sparse. I ordered a simple black coffee and sat with my back firmly against the brick wall, the manila folder resting squarely on the table in front of me. I wore a crisp navy suit and carried myself with the rigid, upright posture of a man completely in command of his physical and mental faculties. There was no medical wheelchair. There was no slack-jawed, vacant stare. There was only the resolute, unyielding founder of Mitchell Global Supply, waiting patiently for his beloved granddaughter. When the bell chimed, Harper walked in. She looked completely drained, her eyes red and puffy from crying over my fabricated demise. She anxiously scanned the room before finally locking onto me. I watched the profound physical shock ripple forcefully through her entire body. She froze completely still in the middle of the aisle. I stood up smoothly, offering a warm, reassuring smile, and opened my arms. She practically ran across the small cafe floor, collapsing against my chest and bursting into violent, uncontrollable, shaking sobs. She gripped my suit jacket desperately, burying her face deep into my shoulder as she wept. She kept repeating how sorry she was, how terrified she had been, and how she truly thought I was lost forever. I held her tightly, letting her cry, until the initial wave of overwhelming emotion began to slowly subside. I gently guided her into the booth and sat directly across from her. She stared at me, her tear-filled eyes wide with absolute stunning bewilderment. She took in my steady, strong hands and sharp demeanor. She whispered that my doctors said I had suffered a massive stroke, that I could not walk or even recognize my own family. I reached across the table and held her trembling hands securely. I told her softly that the doctors had said absolutely no such thing. I told her I was perfectly healthy and that every single word her parents had told her was a calculated, vicious lie. Harper shook her head, utterly unable to comprehend the sheer magnitude of the deception. "Why would they lie about something so horribly cruel?" she asked, her voice cracking with desperate, agonizing confusion. "Why would they intentionally keep you away from my wedding?" I did not offer gentle, comforting words to artificially soften the devastating blow. She was a grown woman, and she needed to clearly see the stark, brutal reality of the people who had raised her. I opened the thick manila folder and slid the first heavy document across the wooden table. I showed her the offshore routing numbers, the massive wire transfer of my entire life savings, and the specific registration of the Cayman Islands shell company operating under her mother's maiden name. I watched her eyes dart rapidly across the pages as I explained how Bradley had manufactured a fake federal audit to terrorize me into blindly handing over my liquid assets. I carefully explained how they had stolen the money she falsely thought was funding her new business venture. Then I pulled out my silver laptop and placed it between us. I told her about the military-grade listening device Jonathan's covert operative had silently planted in the Ritz-Carlton Furfwine P Lounge. I warned her that what she was about to hear would be the most painful thing she would ever experience, but that it was the absolute, undeniable truth. I pressed play. Harper sat rigidly in the booth as the crisp audio filled the small space between us. She heard the clinking crystal glasses. She heard the arrogant, mocking laughter of the venture capitalists. And then she heard her own father's voice boasting about his absolute dominion over the company. She listened as Bradley casually dismissed my entire life, detailing his systematic evil plan to chemically drug me with altered blood pressure medication and lock me away in a closed psychiatric ward by Tuesday morning. She heard him proudly promise the investors a seamless $50 million buyout while I rotted away in a padded room. The blood completely drained from Harper's beautiful face, leaving her pale and visibly trembling. But the digital tape was not over. She listened as her own innocent voice intruded on the recording, desperately asking for me. And then she heard her mother's sickening, sweet voice spinning the vile lie about my stroke, painting a tragic, pathetic picture of a broken old man too ashamed to be seen. She heard Bradley expertly manipulate her deep grief to get her out of the room so he could finalize his corporate treason. I stopped the audio track and gently closed the laptop. The silence at our table was heavier than solid lead. Harper stared blankly at the dark screen, her chest heaving with shallow, highly erratic breaths. Her entire worldview was violently shattering right in front of me. The foundation of love and trust she had built her young life upon was brutally exposed as a rotting, toxic lie. She finally realized the staggering, horrific depth of their depravity. Her beautiful, perfect wedding was nothing but a cheap, extravagant smokescreen. It was a corporate networking gala designed specifically to court the very predators who wanted to butcher her grandfather's legacy. Her parents had used her special day as a glamorous distraction while they attempted to bury me alive and flee the country with a stolen fortune. For several long, agonizing minutes, Harper did not speak a single word. She simply sat there processing the trauma of the ultimate familial betrayal. I watched the profound sadness slowly drain out of her young, tear-stained face. I watched the deep confusion and heartbreak harden into something entirely different. The tears completely stopped falling. Her posture straightened perfectly, mimicking the rigid, unforgiving stance I had adopted since discovering the plot. The devastation in her eyes crystallized into a pure glacial wrath that perfectly mirrored the cold, dangerous fire burning inside my chest. She was a true Mitchell, and the Mitchell blood ran deep. Harper reached up and methodically wiped the remaining moisture from her pale cheeks with the back of her hand. She took a deep, steadying breath, exhaling a long, heavy, ragged sigh. She looked me directly in the eyes. "Grandpa," she said, her voice dropping into a smooth, dangerous calm. "What time is the board meeting tomorrow? I want to watch them burn." I smiled a terrifying smile that matched her icy determination. I told her the meeting was set for 9 o'clock sharp. We spent the entirety of that long Sunday afternoon meticulously coordinating our strike. Harper did not return to the sprawling estate she shared with her new husband, a man handpicked by Bradley to further his corporate image. Instead, she stayed hidden in a luxury suite I booked under a corporate alias. Jonathan Pierce worked through the night finalizing the emergency injunctions and coordinating with his contacts at the Federal Bureau of Investigation. By the time Monday morning arrived, the trap was perfectly set. I dressed with utmost precision, selecting my sharpest, darkest tailored suit, a pristine white shirt and a crimson tie. I did not look like a man suffering from rapid cognitive decline. I looked like the undisputed founder and absolute ruler of Mitchell Global Supply. When my private driver pulled up to the towering glass facade of the corporate headquarters, Jonathan Pierce was already waiting by the entrance. He was accompanied by two stern men wearing immaculate dark suits and discreet earpieces. These were Special Agents Miller and Vance from the Federal White Collar Crime Division. They had reviewed the unedited audio recordings and the forged medical documents late last night. They were fully briefed, fully authorized, and ready to execute the warrants. Harper stepped out of the vehicle behind me wearing a sharp, dark blazer that mirrored my own professional armor. There was no trace of the weeping bride from the day before. We bypassed the reception desk and took the private elevator directly to the top floor. The display blinked upward, counting down the final seconds of Bradley's false empire. We stepped out into the plush, carpeted hallway leading to the primary glass boardroom. It was exactly 8:55 in the morning. Through the frosted privacy bands on the glass walls, I could clearly see the silhouettes. Bradley was sitting at the head of the massive mahogany table, a position he had prematurely claimed. Monica was seated right beside him, wearing a triumphant, predatory smile. Scattered along the length of the table were the senior partners from the State Street venture capital firm, the men who had eagerly toasted to my institutionalization just 48 hours prior. Thick portfolios containing the $50 million sale contracts were neatly arranged in front of them. Expensive pens were literally hovering over the dotted lines. They were mere moments away from finalizing the greatest theft of my entire life. I raised my hand silently, instructing the federal agents to flank the heavy oak doors. I looked at Harper, giving her a single firm nod. She nodded back, her expression perfectly composed. The antique grandfather clock in the executive lobby struck 9 o'clock. The deep chimes echoed down the silent corridor. I reached out, grasped the brass handles of the heavy oak doors, and pushed them violently open. The wooden slabs swung wide, slamming against the interior walls of the boardroom. The sudden explosive noise shattered the quiet professional atmosphere like a gunshot. Every single head in the room snapped toward the entrance in absolute shock. I walked slowly and deliberately into the boardroom, my posture perfectly rigid, my gaze locked entirely on my son. Jonathan Pierce stepped in smoothly to my right, his leather briefcase clutched in his hand. Harper walked in to my left, her chin held high, radiating a quiet, lethal authority. The two federal agents followed closely behind us, immediately taking up positions just inside the doorway, effectively sealing the exit. The color instantly drained from Bradley's face, leaving him looking like a freshly painted corpse. His mouth opened and closed several times, desperately struggling to form basic words as his brain violently rejected the reality standing right in front of him. The expensive silver pen slipped from his trembling fingers and clattered loudly against the polished mahogany wood. Dad, Bradley stammered, his voice cracking into a pathetic, high-pitched squeak. What are you doing here? You are supposed to be resting. The sheer audacity of his lie, spoken even as his world was visibly crumbling, fueled the righteous anger burning deep inside my chest. Monica was completely frozen, her eyes darting frantically between me, the federal agents, and her own daughter. She looked completely terrified. The venture capitalists sat rigidly in their plush chairs, quickly realizing that the incredibly lucrative, seamless acquisition they had been promised was completely imploding before their very eyes. I did not offer a polite greeting. I did not raise my voice or resort to dramatic yelling. I maintained a smooth, icy composure that was far more terrifying than any loud outburst. I walked directly to the head of the table, stopping just inches from where Bradley was sitting. I pulled a thick, heavily stamped file from inside my tailored jacket. It was the fraudulently obtained power of attorney, the forged medical evaluation, and the official injunctions Jonathan had prepared. I raised the heavy stack of documents and slammed it down violently onto the center of the mahogany table. The sharp, explosive crack echoed off the glass walls, making the venture capitalists flinch backward in their seats. I leaned forward, resting my hands firmly on the table, bringing my face perilously close to my treacherous son. "I am not here to rest, Bradley," I stated, my voice echoing with pure glacial wrath. "I am here to clean house." I turned my attention briefly toward the stunned venture investors. "I suggest you gentlemen put your pens away immediately," I instructed them, keeping my tone perfectly civil, but laced with unmistakable menace. "The $50 million acquisition you are currently attempting to finalize is based entirely on fraudulent documents, stolen corporate authority, and a malicious conspiracy to commit an elderly man to a psychiatric facility against his will. Furthermore, as of Friday night, Mitchell Global Supply no longer owns a single proprietary algorithm or logistics patent. The digital assets you thought you were purchasing have been legally extracted and secured in a private holding company. You are currently attempting to buy a completely empty, functionally worthless shell." The lead venture capitalist turned a deep shade of crimson, glaring furiously at Bradley, realizing they had been played for absolute fools. Bradley tried to stand up, his hands shaking violently as he looked toward the door. "You cannot do this," he whispered, sweat beading on his forehead. "I am the acting executive. I have the legal authority." Jonathan Pierce stepped forward, opening his briefcase with a sharp click. "You have absolutely nothing," Bradley the lawyer stated coldly. "I am officially serving you with an emergency federal injunction stripping you of all corporate titles effective immediately." Agent Miller stepped forward, pulling a pair of steel handcuffs from his belt. "Bradley Mitchell," the agent announced, his voice booming across the silent room. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. I strongly suggest you use it." I looked at Harper, who was watching her parents' destruction with an unwavering, tearless gaze. The empire was finally secure, and the trash was being taken out. The lead investor from State Street stared at the heavy mahogany table, his face a mask of absolute fury. He slowly placed his expensive silver pen down next to the unsigned $50 million contract. Jonathan Pierce did not give them a single moment to recover from the shock. He reached into his leather briefcase and extracted a crisp, officially sealed legal document, placing it directly in front of the lad venture capitalist. "I strongly suggest you read the specific addendums regarding intellectual property," Jonathan stated, his voice ringing with absolute unyielding authority. "The company your team spent months evaluating no longer exists in any functional capacity. The Mitchell Global Supply infrastructure is now entirely devoid of its proprietary routing algorithms, its custom supply chain management software, and its massive portfolio of international logistics patents. Every single piece of essential technology required to operate the shipping fleet was legally severed from the primary corporate body on Friday evening. They belong exclusively to Richard. You are looking at a hollow shell consisting of empty warehouses and idle delivery trucks. Bradley promised you a global empire, but he was attempting to sell you an empty cardboard box." The senior investors did not need to hear another word. They were ruthless predators, but they were not fools. They immediately recognized a catastrophic liability when they saw one. The lead partner grabbed the $50 million buyout contract, gripped it tightly with both hands, and ripped the thick stack of papers completely in half. He threw the torn documents directly into Bradley's chest. "You arrogant, stupid boy," the investor hissed, his voice trembling with sheer outrage. "You have wasted our time and completely destroyed your own career in a single morning." The men stood up in perfect unison, grabbing their briefcases, and stormed out of the glass boardroom without a single backward glance, leaving the shattered remains of Bradley's corporate dreams scattered across the floor. Bradley collapsed backward into his heavy leather chair. He looked completely defeated, gasping for air like a fish thrown onto dry land. Monica was shaking violently beside him, her eyes darting toward the exit, desperately searching for an escape that no longer existed. But I was not finished. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out a small matte black flash drive. I tossed it onto the polished table where it slid to a halt right in front of my son. That drive contains the unedited high-fidelity audio recording of your private celebration in the Ritz-Carlton Fauteuil. IP lounge, I said, my voice dropping into a smooth glacial whisper. It clearly details your entire manufactured medical strategy. I heard every single word, Bradley. I heard you gloat about tampering with my blood pressure medication. I heard your meticulous, calculated plan to strip away my human rights and abandon me in a closed psychiatric ward. I heard you brag about the offshore accounts in the Cayman Islands. Monica let out a sharp, hysterical scream, covering her face with her hands, as the sheer magnitude of their exposure finally crashed down upon her. The two federal FBI agents who had been standing silently by the heavy oak doors immediately stepped forward into the center of the room. The metallic clink of steel handcuffs echoed sharply through the quiet boardroom. Agent Miller grabbed Bradley by his shoulder, forcing him out of the expensive leather chair and twisting his arms firmly behind his back. "Bradley Mitchell," the agent announced, his voice booming with absolute terrifying finality. "You are under arrest for federal wire fraud, massive corporate embezzlement, and criminal conspiracy. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Bradley began to sob openly, his knees buckling as the cold steel locked tightly around his wrists. He looked absolutely pathetic, stripped of his expensive suits and his arrogant illusions. "Please, Dad," he begged, tears streaming down his pale, sweaty face. "Please stop this. I am your son. We can fix this. I will give everything back." Before I could even respond to his pathetic pleading, Harper stepped forward from the shadows. She walked slowly and deliberately around the massive table, her posture radiating an incredible icy strength. She stopped directly in front of her weeping mother. Monica looked up, her eyes pleading for a shred of sympathy from the daughter she had manipulated so deeply. Harper did not offer a single word of comfort. Instead, she reached up to her ears and unclasped the heavy, sparkling diamond earrings she was wearing. They were the extravagant wedding gift Monica had purchased using the stolen funds from my offshore accounts. Harper dropped the glittering diamonds onto the mahogany table. They landed with a sharp, dismissive clatter right next to the torn contracts. "I am moving in with Grandpa Harper," stated her voice perfectly steady and completely devoid of emotion. "You are absolutely dead to me." The federal agents began dragging Bradley aggressively toward the boardroom exit. He was dragging his feet, desperately fighting against their firm grip, completely overcome by pure, unadulterated panic. His eyes found mine across the long expanse of the polished table. "Dad, please do not do this to me," he wailed, his voice cracking into a high, desperate scream. "Show some mercy. You cannot just lock me out of my own life." I stood tall, buttoning my suit jacket with slow, deliberate precision. I remembered the heavy brass doors of the Ritz-Carlton. I remembered standing on the cold pavement blocked by security guards while my own family celebrated my destruction inside. I looked my son dead in the eye, feeling absolutely nothing but cold, satisfying finality. "You are not on the list, Bradley," I replied, my voice slicing through his hysterical sobbing like a cold, razor-sharp steel blade. There was obviously a terrible mistake. I turned my back on him without a single ounce of weak hesitation. I offered my arm to Harper. She took it firmly, holding her head high. Together we walked out of the glass boardroom, leaving the ruined, pathetic ashes of his false empire far behind us. We stepped into the private elevator, leaving the screaming and the handcuffs to the authorities, ready to finally begin our new life. Standing on my balcony looking out over Boston Harbor, sipping black coffee with Harper, I realized the absolute hardest truth of my 70 years. Blood makes you related, but loyalty, respect, and integrity are what truly make you family. We spend our entire lives building empires to pass down to our children, hoping our sacrifices will secure their love. But greed is a vile cancer that can rot the deepest bonds. Never apologize for protecting your dignity and your legacy. Sometimes the only way to save your family tree is to ruthlessly cut off the branches that turned to poison. If my story opened your eyes, hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Have you ever faced betrayal from the ones you trusted the most? Tell me your story in the comments below. Let us stand strong together. See you in the next story. With love and respect.